I was standing in my son's room with my hand still on his blanket when I heard the crying directly behind me, clear and close, even though I was already looking at his sleeping face. I turned slowly, expecting to see nothing, but the sound did not stop when I moved, and it stayed exactly where I had been standing. That was when I understood that whatever had been crying every night was never coming from his bed. 2 weeks earlier, everything had still followed a pattern that felt normal enough to ignore. Every night around the same time, the crying would start, sharp and desperate, cutting through the quiet apartment. I would get up immediately, barefoot on cold tile, heart already racing before I reached his door. Each time I found him asleep, breathing evenly. No tears, no movement, no signs he had made a sound. I told myself children cry in their sleep. That exhaustion makes parents imagine things. That stress fills in gaps with noise. I adjusted his blanket every night, checked his mouth, his chest, his hands, and then went back to bed. The crying always stopped the moment I entered the room, which felt like proof that it was real and not in my head. On the 4th night, I installed a small camera in his room because I needed confirmation that I was not losing control of my senses. I reviewed the footage every morning, watching hours of stillness broken only by my own figure entering the room. The audio track was clean, silent, untouched by any sound resembling crying. I stopped telling anyone about it because the silence on the recording felt like a warning. By the 7th night, the crying had started earlier and lasted longer, sometimes following me halfway down the hallway before vanishing. I began sleeping in short stretches, waiting for the sound instead of being woken by it. I noticed my son had stopped speaking during the day, but I blamed it on a phase, a mood, a child's strange logic. He ate less, stared more, and avoided looking directly at me. When I asked him if he cried at night, he only shook his head and turned away. On the 10th night, the crying sounded closer than ever, like it was inside the walls, and I pressed my ear against his door before opening it. The room was still, the air heavy, and my son lay exactly as I had left him hours earlier. I checked his throat for soreness, his eyes for redness, his pillow for moisture, and found nothing. That was the night I realized the crying did not belong to a sleeping child at all. I started staying awake after midnight, sitting on the edge of my bed, counting the seconds between breaths. When the crying came, it no longer surprised me, but it never came from the same direction twice. Sometimes it rose from the hallway, sometimes from the kitchen, sometimes from directly behind my bedroom door. I followed it every time, moving slowly, turning on lights, opening closets, checking behind furniture. The sound always led me back to my son's room, like a path that ended at his bed. I began noticing marks on my own arms in the mornings, faint red lines I could not remember making. My son stopped responding when I spoke to him, even when I raised my voice. I scheduled a doctor's appointment after he went an entire day without making a single sound. At night, the crying became steadier, less frantic, almost controlled. I stood in his room longer each time, waiting for something to happen, waiting for proof. On the 14th night, I leaned over him and adjusted the blanket the way I always did. The crying started immediately, loud enough to make my ears ring. It did not come from the bed, and it did not echo. It came from directly behind my head, close enough that I could feel the vibration of sound against my neck. I did not turn around at first because I already knew nothing would be there. I stayed frozen, one hand on the blanket, listening to the sound continue without pause. When it finally stopped, the room felt wrong, like something had finished its task. My son did not move, did not stir, did not react. The next morning, I carried him to the clinic because he refused to walk on his own. The doctor examined him carefully, checked his throat, his ears, his lungs, and then looked at me for a long time without speaking. He asked me when my son had last cried, and I told him the truth. He corrected me calmly and said my son had not produced any sound at all in over 2 weeks. He said the vocal cords showed no recent activity, no strain, no use. He asked if anyone else lived with us, and I said no. I did not tell him about the camera, the hallway, or the sound behind me. When we returned home, the apartment felt smaller, tighter, like the walls had shifted while we were gone. That night, I did not wait for the crying to start. I went straight to his room, turned off the light, and stood in the same place as always. The crying began instantly, right behind me, exactly where I had been standing before. I understood then that the sound was never meant for my son at all. I covered him carefully, making sure the blanket did not move, making sure he stayed asleep. The crying continued, steady and patient, as if waiting for a response. I did not turn around because I finally recognized the rhythm. It matched my breathing from weeks ago, from nights I barely remembered. I remembered standing in the dark after long days, pressing my hands over my mouth to keep from making noise. I remembered how fear sounds when it is forced inward instead of released. The realization settled slowly and completely. The crying had been mine every night, recorded by the walls, reflected back when the apartment went quiet. My son had learned silence because sound had become dangerous. He had stopped speaking because every noise brought me running, tense and afraid. I stood there listening to myself from the past, from exhaustion, from desperation, from nights I had erased. The sound faded as it always did, leaving only the quiet and the weight of what I had done. I stepped out of the room and closed the door without looking back. I did not check the camera again. I did not wait for the crying to return. I chose to leave the silence where it was and walk away from the door. One last question. If you were in her place at that moment, would you have done the same? Be honest, What does her choice deserve out of 10?